Welcome all, and thank you for joining us for today's Public Funds Public Schools webinar. I'm Catherine Dunn with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and we at SPLC partner with the Education Law Center and Munger, Tolles & Olson on the Public Funds Public Schools campaign, fighting to ensure that all public funds for education are used to maintain and support public schools through multiple strategies, including litigation, advocacy, and research. Today, the PFPS team is so honored to have Jennifer Berkshire and Jack Schneider join us to discuss their new book, A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, The Dismantling of Public Education and the Future of School, in a conversation moderated by Carol Burris of the Network for Public Education. This webinar is the 7th in our series, and it's being recorded. As with all of our webinars, you can find them on our website at pfps.org under the advocacy page. Be sure to sign up for emails while you're there to get updates from our team, including about future webinars. And during today's webinar, please submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. We'll get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. I'll briefly introduce our panelists, who, like our incoming First Lady, all hold the distinguished title of Doctor. Dr. Jennifer Berkshire is a journalist who has written extensively for national outlets about the politics of education. She is also a licensed teacher and former editor of the statewide newspaper of AFT, Massachusetts, and she is creator and co-host of the popular education policy podcast, Have You Heard?, along with her co-author. Dr. Jack Schneider is an education historian and assistant professor at UMass Lowell. He is also the co-founder of the Massachusetts Consortium for Innovative Education Assessment and has written numerous books and articles on education policy. Dr. Carol Burris will moderate our discussion today. She's the Executive Director of the Network for Public Education and has a background as an educator at the middle and high school levels, including as a principal. I will kick it to our panel now.
Hi, everybody, and Jennifer and Jack, thank you so much for coming on today and talking about your book. I just finished it this morning, and I have to tell everybody, it is fabulous. Go into the chat, get that link, and get that book. You will not be sorry. So my first question that comes from reading your book is that in the 1980s, vouchers were really roundly rejected by the public. Yet there now appears to be a growing movement toward vouchers and neo-vouchers that you talk about in the book. Most of it is happening on the right, but we even see popularity of voucher programs among EdPost bloggers and 50Can. Why is that happening today?
Jennifer, I'll get it started and you tell me what I miss. So one of the things that Jennifer and I have talked about both on our podcast and in pieces that we've written, we wrote a piece in the New York Times recently where we made this argument. For the past couple of decades, there has been a working consensus in Washington, but also as well as at the state level in a number of states, a kind of treaty between conservatives and neoliberals. In this treaty, the left gave up historic support for teachers and their unions, gave up a push for racially integrated schools, and gave up the push for equitable and adequate funding for schools. The right gave up the push for religion in schools, as well as its voucher efforts. So Reagan was the last Republican to push for vouchers for several decades until DeVos. Under Trump, obviously. And in this consensus, right, the agreement was that schools should be run like a business. This was something that neoliberals and conservatives could agree on. They focused on performance management, and that's testing and accountability. And they focused on, elements of the public sector operating like a free market. And we see that in charters, right? Charters are public schools, but they are run in the style of private schools which operate in the free market. So this was what we had in the 90s and the 2000s as education policy, at least at the federal level, until DeVos came along and broke that consensus And what we can see is that when she broke that treaty, it revealed that for conservatives, for ideological conservatives like DeVos, the treaty was never the end game. It was always a means to an end. The left really wasn't working towards a long-term aim. I shouldn't say the left, I should say centrist Democrats or neoliberals, whereas the right was really working towards, chipping away towards this long-term aim of privatizing schools. And clearly DeVos revealed that through her support for vouchers. And even though she didn't win on that, we've seen the real normalization of choice and private values across the past couple decades that she took to an even further extreme during her tenure as secretary.
And I would just add to that we saw the sort of the worst of the crumbling of the treaty during the DeVos era in that all of a sudden vouchers are back, right? Like all of a sudden she opened the door for religious charter schools. But a lot of the things that were sort of off the table were things that people really care about and should care about, right? So you now hear all these calls to finally make funding more equitable coming up. In our state, home state of Massachusetts, for example, we have this, we have a grand bargain here. Everybody got together and they agreed, schools would get some more money, but we'd have accountability, we'd have charters, teachers unions would be reined in. Well, now that that's starting to crumble, all of a sudden Democrats for Education Reform is talking about desegregation. Are they sincere? I don't know, but I think it's a really interesting development. And this is both, we should be concerned about what's happening at the state level and with conservatives pushing vouchers, but also see this as an opportunity to push for things that really matter.
It's interesting because I always think about conservatives as being folks that are interested in cutting costs. Why then are they so interested in vouchers, which essentially takes the price tag and raises it for all schools?
Jennifer, I'll start with this one again, and again, tell me what I miss here. So you're right that conservatives like DeVos are absolutely interested in cutting costs. It's a tenet of the ideology that supports this broader push to dismantle public education, right? The other tenets being a war on labor, a long-running war on labor, a desire to elevate private aims over public aims, and then just a deep faith in markets, that markets work. Government doesn't. And you're right that, seemingly, if what we did was we moved per pupil expenditures onto vouchers and then handed those out to people, not only would it keep current expenditures at what they are, $500 billion a year if you add everything up, but it actually would raise them because, there potentially would be private school families who are currently in the system who would be pulling money out of public schools that currently isn't in the Treasury. So I think the way to think about this is, as we alluded to in our first response, this is again a means to an end. There's a long game here, and universal vouchers are just about reframing schools as individual benefit organizations rather than as public infrastructure, right? This is something that you get that belongs to you. It's not something that we all collectively do. It's not something that taxpayers benefit from. That's one of the messages you send through a universal voucher. And if you do that, you can eventually move people to believe that if it's an individual enterprise with an individual benefit, then if they can pay for it themselves, they should. And you then move those people out of your expenditure column. And eventually you lower expenditures for the least advantaged because you say, well, why should these kids be learning how to be poets or, how to play violin? We should instead just be giving them something incredibly basic. And we can envision those becoming known as charity vouchers, that's what you would get. So you would dramatically reduce costs. And you've got to think about that long-term aim here.
I'm really enjoying how Jack basically has to do the heavy lifting, and then I get to step in and just sort of
I'm
put
done
the
after this. I'm done.
bring the punctuation. So we've had such a shocking wake-up call during the pandemic about all the things that schools do besides, say, raising math and English test scores. And so whenever you see somebody say tweeting about how we ought to just give the money to the parents and let them direct it to whatever quote unquote learning option they think is the best fit for their child, keep in mind that they're not talking about replacing all those other things that schools do, right? They're not talking about, we rely on our schools to be the social welfare safety net in this country. When people talk about shifting, giving parents vouchers or just giving the money to the parents, there you'll notice there's never any mention about the long list of services that schools provide in addition to quote unquote learning options.
Now, it's so interesting that you say that. I mean, I think about my years being a principal. One of my important functions was notifying CPS. If something was going wrong at home, dealing with kids who had depression. But I think what I'm hearing you say is something that I've long suspected, and it's almost a thesis of your book, that the privatizers like Betsy DeVos are not really interested in providing choice and alternatives to public schools. They're really intent on destroying the public school system as we know it. Is that too strong?
I really don't think it is too strong. And I think one of the things that's so hard to wrap our heads around is that this, at the end of the day, is actually not that focused on education itself, right? The goal, when you say their goal is to destroy the system, it is in the sense that they view it as, it's socialism. It redistributes money from makers to takers. It's the system, however flawed it may be, is filled with all kinds of ways for people to exert collective demands. Whether it's the collective demands that parents in a neighborhood make, whether it's the teachers in unions, right? And their demands, not just for themselves and not even just for the people in their school community, but the demands that teachers make on behalf of the kids and parents in their state, right? They're constantly demanding things like more funding for schools, a more generous safety net, a higher minimum wage, etc. And so by breaking the system down into these sort of component parts, right? Like not even talking about school choice anymore necessarily, but learning options, right? Where it's an endless sort of bundle of options and all the pressure points where we might band together to demand something better for our own kids, for other people's kids, those disappear. And the end goal is always to reduce the tax burden on the wealthiest in our society. So when I say it's not ultimately, even the end goal isn't focused on public education itself, that's what I'm talking about. And sorry to bring such a dark vision.
Well, let me make that just one shade darker, and say that, it's not only all the things that Jennifer said, she's 100% right about that, but it's also about um, limiting the contacts that people have in civil society, right? It's promoting a further fragmentation that for many of the sort of hardest right um, advocates of unmaking public schools, the atomization of American society is a good thing, right? That actually that's what democracy should look like, is each person scrambling for their own self-interest in the free market. That's how we can determine what is best, is allow people to vote with their dollars and pursue their own self-interest. And think about how civil society has withered over the past 50 years, 100 years. Where are the places where we come together? The public education system is the top place where we are likely to encounter each other as citizens. How many of us have served on juries this year? Not many of us. How often do we vote? Not often. And we do so in isolation. The public schools are one of the last vestiges of civil society.
So let's take this scheme to its logical conclusion, right? So we have the backpack full of cash and kids shop for schools. But there is another thing that happens, especially when you're talking about private schools, and that's that the schools shop for kids. And some of those kids are kids that are seen as attractive, and some are not. In your book, you provide some really good examples of the discrimination that takes place in Florida's private voucher schools. So, if the public system is replaced by a private system, what's going to happen regarding discrimination, in your opinion?
So, I mean, we lacked for nothing when we were writing that chapter about the various ways that parents have been taken advantage of in Florida. And the problem is that basically, just as in Arizona, written into the program is that there's no oversight, right? And so you would hear these terrible stories about parents feeling that their kids were discriminated against, or they weren't getting any special ed services, and then they would go to try to call somebody, and there wasn't anybody to call, right? It's not the state's job to see it. And so this is such a great example of what happens when you take something like public education and move it out from under public oversight. That like, parents have all kinds of reasons for wanting to pursue an alternative, but why does the alternative have to come along with giving up all of their rights, right? And so that, I mean, I think that because we are, as we're going to talk about at the end of the webinar, we predict that we're going to see a pretty aggressive push to expand these sorts of programs. And so we're going to have to start paying attention to things like these oversight guardrails.
Yeah, just to add a couple details here, reporters have done an incredible job here, right? I happen to be partnered on this project with a journalist who's really adept at, digging in deep and listening to people and following leads. And we have investigative reporting in Florida showing us, how dangerous some of the curricular materials are. And I don't mean just denying science, right? Denying the reality of climate change, or, talking about the age of the earth in ways that are just simply not true. But I mean, dangerous in terms of talking about particular religious faiths, and what they believe. And I don't mean talking about your own faith, right? I'm talking about what other faiths believe and what they are intent on doing. So thinking about how American Muslims and Muslims internationally are portrayed in some of these curricular materials. I'm thinking about LGBTQ students, the ways in which they are portrayed, not students particularly, but members of those groups, how they're portrayed, how human sexuality is talked about, and how those students are basically driven out of these schools in ways that would horrify us in any setting. But the fact that public dollars are going to these schools is even more upsetting, because we lack the public oversight and accountability mechanisms that we have in the public system. And then Jennifer mentioned special education, right? So many families are lured into these schools via marketing, what we in the book call advertising, a phrase that we borrow from a couple of other scholars. And in a free market, schools have every incentive to market themselves, to engage in this advertising practice. By the way, there are no rules around that, right? It's even worse than the pharmaceutical industry, which at least is checked in some fashion. You can say whatever you want about these schools. You can say that, we specialize in serving the needs of special education students. And then once they're there and you've got their dollars, you can say, I'm sorry, we can't do any of the things that you claim to need. You're going to have to go someplace else after you've captured their dollars. These practices, again, are practices that are, should shock the conscience. And the fact that we are then left with no mechanism for remedying them, that's even more disturbing.
I just want to add one last little point to that. We have to keep an eye on what's happening at the Supreme Court level as well. So one of the reasons that these programs did sort of stall out, Carol, as you mentioned, was that, the Supreme Court would rule that, we had this, sort of a wall between church and state. We've now had a series of cases, sort of rulings handed down, where that view seems to be, fading in the eye of the court. So not only did we have Espinoza about school vouchers in Montana, which this group did an excellent webinar about, but now there are a whole series of cases basically to push the idea that religious groups should be able to take public money, but be able to discriminate, and that the inability to discriminate is a violation of their freedom of speech. So this, these are really concerning. These are going to have profound implications for public education, but really this whole idea of money going to fund organizations that discriminate. Like I'm sure a lot of people heard when Amy Coney Barrett was on her way to the Supreme Court, it turned out she was on the board of a religious school in Indiana, where, they wouldn't accept kids whose parents weren't married. So according to this logic, not only would that school be eligible for public funds, as it already is in Indiana, but the ability, denying them funds because they won't accept kids with unmarried parents would be considered discrimination, right? Like it's a crazy upside down way to see the world, but it's really what's coming.
Talking about Espinosa and other seminars that Public Funds for Public Schools has put forth, and they're fabulous. I really encourage everybody to watch them all. There were two that I think are very much related to your book. One was a webinar with Derek Black on his new book, Schoolhouse Burning. And the second was with Stephen Suits on Overturning Brown. How does Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door connect the historical instances that they talk about in their books?
Well, I'll jump in since you used the magical word historical there. That gets my spider sense tingling. So Derek's book, Derek Black's fantastic book, teaches us a lot. And we've had Derek on our podcast, and we actually wrote an op-ed with Derek and Diane Ravitch in the Philadelphia Inquirer. So, one of the things that Derek's book teaches us is that public education has always been an essential component of democracy in this country, right? That it's not that we have democracy and we have education. It's that we have democracy and public education, right? That they go together. And that's because education is too important to the functioning of a democratic society to be left to the whims of the market. We know that the market fails in lots of ways, right? I'm not saying the market fails all the time. I'm not saying that the market fails sometimes in reliable ways. I'm saying sometimes in reliable ways in education, the market fails. And because of that, the consequences would be dire. Imagine if the market failed to reach large swaths of children, particularly in some systematic way. Black children, children from low-income backgrounds, right? We've seen this happen, actually, even with public education because of systematic discrimination. So we know today more than ever how important public education is. And the fact that this is an old commitment, I think, reminds us that the radical vision here is the vision of public education as a private good, as something that could be left up to the market, right? Because individuals are pursuing it for their own interests. That's the radical vision, not the vision that public education is a public good that should be provided adequately and equitably. That's a conservative vision, right? And so, I think that that reframing that Derek Black's work has done here to show us how critical public education is to democracy, how far we've come, and how far we have yet to go in terms of really living out our ideals, and creating a public education system that really does work hand in hand with a democratic society. The way to get there is not to pull it all apart.
Well, one of my big regrets is that when I was scheduled to go to Georgia, and I was actually going to get to hang out with Steve Suits, whose job it is, that my job is to talk a little bit about his book, his fantastic book, Overturning Brown. So when Jack and I started working on this book, it really was sort of fueled by this question: how was it that these policy ideas that had really kind of faded into obscurity during the Reagan era, why were they suddenly back with a vengeance and being presented as kind of just like disruptive innovations? And what we soon discovered, and I'm sure this is no news to Jack at all because he's an historian, was that we had to keep going back, and we had to keep going back, and we had to keep going back, because ultimately, this is a very, very old argument that there has been resistance to paying for public goods, right? That goes way back. So Steve Suits recounts this sort of lost history of all of these southern states to privatize education systems rather than to desegregate. And one of the things that's so really, to me, so chilling about that history is that there's a moment when you see a powerful subset of these folks realize, we're not winning the argument when we base it on race. Let's use the language of the market instead. And so you take, for example, the economist James Buchanan in Virginia, right? He writes this very clinical memo where he lays out the kinds of language that they should be using, things like parent choice and autonomy, and that schools would compete against each other, and this would enable parents to find the best fit. And it's virtually identical to the language that's being used today. But the reason that he was making this argument was to justify Virginia closing down its public schools and opening up publicly funded private schools that wouldn't take all kids in their place. So I hope that people will, if you haven't seen that webinar and read Steve's book, you really should. But one of the things that I've learned co-hosting a podcast and now co-authoring a book with an education historian is that we all need to learn a little more education history.
Both of you, in the answering that question, talked about the market, and the market being, well, part of the market is for profit, right? And I think it probably makes some sense for us to talk just a little bit about for-profit schooling, which you also talk about in the book. You have for-profit private schools. You have about 13% of all charter schools being for-profit, and even in the college sector. We have about 10%, I think you say, of the book of colleges being for-profit schools. How does that work? And what are the concerns that you have of having profit enter into the equation?
You want me to take it? I'll start. So yeah, I think that the most basic thing to understand is that it's all about trimming the fat, but there's no fat in public education. So what are you trimming, right? You're cutting away necessary funds in order to return value to shareholders, right? So the way that this works, for those unfamiliar, is that a for-profit provider receives the per pupil expenditure that the school would receive to hire teachers and keep the lights on. And it would then seek to reduce costs, right? This was the old Edison schools model developed by Chris Whittle, that they would seek efficiencies, economies of scale, and other kinds of efficiencies that they imagined existed, imagined being the operative word here. And they would then take those savings and then return them to shareholders and then further grow their business. Well, Chris Whittle was wrong about this enterprise, but smart enough to know to get out of it. So now he's pursuing this kind of practice where there actually is some fat to trim in hyper elite private schooling. So charging, upwards of $60,000-$70,000 a year at avenues. I forget what they call it, the World School, I think. And what they're selling is uber luxury. Right? There's a place where probably there's room to make a couple $1,000 per kid off of their parents. But when we're talking about public education, there isn't that room. And I think, what we've seen then is actually a shift over the past couple decades to a sort of shadier set of accounting practices, because of course people don't like this idea that you're just going to reduce expenditures on kids. So the shadier accounting practices we've seen even with nonprofits, right? So some charters sign exclusive contracts for services or these bloated lease agreements, which then end up funneling public monies, to private individuals who become quite wealthy, at least by my standards, as a result of these practices. For me, I think the bottom line is that if there's transparency, and there isn't always, and accountability, that the public will become outraged by this. The really scary piece is that once you lose the transparency piece and the accountability piece, certainly there are rapacious people out there without the scruples to stop them from doing this.
For our 100th podcast episode for our show, Have You Heard? We interviewed a former lobbyist and PR guy for the Goldwater Institute in Arizona, and he switched teams. He assists pro public education groups, and he works with candidates. But he was really, we got him to talk about this, sort of like, what's the end goal? And again and again, he would tell us, he read the book and he said, your vision isn't quite bleak enough. And he was very clear about the fact that, part of the justification for breaking up the system is to create more profit points, right? That we talked earlier about the idea that vouchers that the state pays for are really kind of a transitional thing. And the goal is to shift the financial burden onto parents themselves. Well, what would go along with that? A robust loan market for K-12 schools, obviously, right? Like, you'll often hear DeVos and her allies talk about, even as we're bemoaning college debt, right? They seem to view it as a success story. They view for-profit colleges as a success story. What are we seeing? What are they seeing that we're missing? Well, this is a big part of it, that there are all these other opportunities to profit. And that's considered, that's considered the mark of a successful product in a successful market. And so we drew some of our chapter on for-profit higher ed. We were inspired by Tressie McMillan Cottom, who makes the argument that she calls the sector lower ed, and talks about how it's all about shifting the financial burden onto the backs of students who can least afford it. She's talking about, minorities, adults who are going back to school to get, skills training, and how they end up with lots of debt and degrees that aren't necessarily worth anything. Well, our big concern is that that's actually the model that's being pushed in K-12, right? To shift the risk onto the parents who can least afford that. And maybe you'll get a percentage of what it costs from the government, but it will never be enough, right? And there'll be somebody there offering to, oh, we'll lend you some money so that you can pay for ABC Mouse, etc. It's not a pretty picture.
Or I think at the very least, then starting to see for the public, for the kids that can't afford the private schools. I have this horrible vision of them being warehoused in rooms of 100 with somebody standing at the door, arms folded, while they work on online programs. And that minimal, and Chile in many ways has almost adopted a model that's similar. So let me give you just one more question before we go to the questions from our audience. And that's, where do we go from here, right? The GOP made big gains in 2020. political leaders are already indicating that they plan to aggressively expand school choice. It's happening in New Hampshire right now. How should public school advocates respond?
So we're in this very strange moment where the kind of horrors of virtual schooling have been revealed to the world, right? That an idea that seemed sellable in the abstract turns out to be something that parents and students are running, kicking and screaming from. So I bring this up because while the political balance may have shifted in some states and Democrats did not make the gains they had hoped to make, this what's being sold remains unpopular. We'll often hear about polls indicating that various school choice proposals are wildly popular. They've never been more popular, but every time they're put up to a public vote, not only do they fail, but they fail by pretty much the same. It's usually something like a 60-40. Arizona being the most recent. So I would just remind people that as this stuff rolled out in your state, keep that in mind and always pay attention to the big picture. The policies appear very incremental. Charles Koch uses the metaphor of, like putting a brick in the wall and then the mortar around it, you create a space for another brick, right? That's what we have to keep our eyes on. But on the other hand, we've also seen during this crazy time that just how parents are desperate to get those schools open again, and we need to also make sure that that sort of the energy and the enthusiasm around public education, that we're able to capitalize on that.
Yeah, I think that, one key piece here is that the public has been convinced, even while they maintain pretty solid faith in the schools that their own kids attend, the public has been convinced that America's schools are, in decline, if not already in the toilet. So we see from annual Phi Delta Kappa polling that Americans say, well, my own kid's school, I give an A or a B. This is the vast majority of them who say this. But the nation's schools, I give a C or a D, right? This not only has opened a window for highly interventionist reform, but is also the creation of those who wanted to convince the public that reform was necessary. So, this neoliberal conservative treaty that we talked about, half an hour ago, much of it was predicated on convincing the public that public education was a failure, and that we needed something new. And now centrist Democrats particularly are sort of reaping the whirlwind because many of them actually believe strongly in public education. They just wanted something more corporate. They wanted testing and accountability and centralized control and efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the selling point here, for the left particularly, but as Jennifer points out all the time, ordinary everyday conservatives also happen to like their public schools and don't want them to go anywhere. The message, I think, has to be that you don't fix public education by privatizing it. You fix public education by doubling down on the public nature of it. So, we talked a little bit earlier about Derek Black's book and, the importance of public education and how it has become more and more public over time. And I think there are 3 areas where public education can still become more public in ways that would really appeal not just to Democrats, but also to Republicans, and that really make a strong case for public education in the face of threats. So the first is to ensure that our public schools are doing the things that the public values. And we know that pursuing standardized test scores in math and English does not align with what the public wants schools to do. They want the schools to pursue a broader mission than that, and they always have. The second is think about who the public is, right? We live in a very diverse democracy. Our schools should be fully integrated, racially and economically. And then third, public means fully funded, right? Here's something I'm going to start saying, is that public means fully funded. Why? Because it implies that no deficit needs to be made up for via private funds, right? That's what public means. It means I don't need to fish into my pocket for loose change to come up with whatever balance public funds didn't cover. So let's start thinking about it and talking about it that way, that that's what public means, and talk about investing in our schools so that all of them are adequately and equitably funded.
Thank you. This very rich discussion has inspired a lot of questions, so we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. I'll start with a question that kind of builds off Carol's last question about what might be happening in the states, given some gains in 2020. The reverse is, how much power, an anonymous attendee asked, how much power will the Biden administration have to turn the voucher privatization movement around, and what will it take?
So I'll start with that. The single most important thing that the Biden administration is going to be able to do, and this includes not just the Secretary of Education, but also Dr. Jill Biden, is to be, just as Betsy DeVos used her bully pulpit to beat up on the public schools and to relentlessly push for private school choice. The Biden officials have the opportunity to really be a voice for public education, and public education for rural kids, for urban kids. This is going to be particularly important because, unfortunately, we're headed into some pretty bleak economic times. There's no getting around that. It's looking like, there's going to be some kind of a stimulus package, but it won't be enough. And so a lot of places are going to be contending with school closings, right? In cities, in rural areas. And that, I think that those officials have the opportunity to tell a different story about public education besides what it's lacking, and also the kind of instrumentalist vision that the Obama folks pushed, which is that, public education exists to raise your test scores and to put you on a path to college and to international competition.
I'm not sure. I shouldn't have even unmuted. I'm not sure there's anything that can be added to that, perfect and complete answer. So I won't even try.
Carol, I think you're muted.
Oh, if I could just jump in for a second, one thing that occurred to me is in the area of civil rights and through the Office of Civil Rights. And that is to take a look at any place where there is discrimination that's happening in schools that are receiving public funds or not receiving public funds, and to see if there is not something that can be done. I mean, after all, schools do receive Title I funding, to try to make sure that discrimination is reduced.
Great point. Tony asks, isn't the voucher movement ultimately intended to keep students away from liberal thinking in public schools, and to maybe segregate students based on achievement levels and the like? Can you speak to whether that's the goal of the voucher movement and privatization movement?
So this is another thing that you learn reading back through that rich history, is just how long our wealthiest Americans have been concerned that the schools are not doing an adequate job of teaching students to be appreciative enough of free enterprise. We have an episode of our podcast coming out tomorrow that's an interview with Reaganland author Rick Perlstein, and this is something that he describes at some length. Somebody asked about the name of our podcast. It's Have You Heard? So yes, this is a constant theme. I just started reading Charles Koch's new book, and this is really his entire focus, is to create, let's have alternatives outside of the public school setting. And this is where kids are going to learn to be what he calls social entrepreneurs. So that remains a big issue. And especially as you see intense partisanship, already higher education has come under increasing attack on the right as being, these are sort of liberal camps of indoctrination. You're starting to hear that same language being used to describe K-12, something that I really worry about. But I think that will also very much be used to fuel the push for vouchers as a vouchers as a tool for fleeing schools that are seen as insufficiently conservative. And there was a second part of your question, and Jack will address that.
I don't even remember, but I will jump in and say that, while many conservatives believe that the schools are insufficiently religious, insufficiently patriotic, insufficiently segregated, there's also this more ideological, can it get more ideological, more abstractly ideological component, which we talked about a little bit earlier, and that is that education is a private enterprise, right? That it is personal rather than collective, that it's private rather than public, and that you should seek your own self-interest, right? Think about, greed is good as a kind of ethos there. In pursuing your own self-interest, each individual will be contributing to the whole. That's a very different understanding of society than a lot of us have. And so for many of those who support the devolution or, the unmaking of public education, they actually don't care what people want schools to do for their kids. They're agnostic about questions of faith or patriotism. Or what they want is for people to be able to pursue their own private aims without anybody telling them what to do. And so this is a conception of freedom that runs counter to, some of the other ways that we might define it. If there was a second part to the question, I'm happy to take a shot at it, but I'll admit I don't remember.
That was perfect. Thanks. And Carol, obviously jump in on any of these too. We have a couple of questions here that I'll just kind of group together about how whether race factors into the popularity of vouchers, and in particular, public school advocates who might be working with, Black or brown families where their public schools aren't meeting their needs currently, and how to navigate that in this work, pushing for a system that can serve all kids.
So I have a couple thoughts about that. I would say that, if you're in a place like Florida where, it's unquestionable, right? These voucher programs are really popular. But why should somebody seeking an option for their kid, why should they have to give up their rights? So that seems like an argument that public school advocates could make to try to change that system, demand more oversight, demand more accountability. I think it's absolutely a terrible idea to sort of center your advocacy on making people feel bad. The other thing is that, we've had such a wake up call during this pandemic, and I saw a panel yesterday where a superintendent for a small rural district in South Carolina was asked about, how are you planning on transforming your schools post-pandemic? And he was sort of like, transforming our school, we discovered that school is the place where some of our kids eat their only meal. I think we have a broader transformation to talk about than changing the structure of our school. And I mention that because so much of the tension in the debate over what kind of schools we have is that we have these cities that are sort of structured around a competitive model, right? That they're only enough quality seats for this number of kids, and this school is going to compete against this school. And I'm hoping that part of the change in the narrative is to move away from that model, so that you can't criticize a parent's choice, but we can definitely criticize a system that pits parents against one another.
I think one of the things that we haven't talked about too is the effect on public schools and what happens to funds, right? I mean, there is no doubt, it's well established, money matters when it comes to public schools. There are many scholarly articles that prove that and prove it very well. And what's happening with a lot of the systems of choice is that the money then gets pulled out of the system. So now you have, for example, Muncie, Indiana, almost losing its public school system, Chester Upland, which looks like it's on the verge of being taken over by a for-profit charter school system, Allentown. The kids go, the money goes with the kids, sometimes in just extraordinary amounts. And then what happens, there are all these costs that are left behind. And so the public school deteriorates further. And what happens? The kids that are the most difficult to teach, the kids with the greatest needs, they're always the kids left behind. So to try to put out these little life rafts with vouchers and neo-vouchers and homeschools and charter schools, and then let the ship itself sink, is not in the best interest of kids. And by narrowing these other options, by eliminating them, by making them more public, by stifling their growth, what we need to be doing then with the funds that return to the public schools are to make them better. I mean, public schools are far from perfect. We have to demand change. But the problem is, you get caught in this death spiral when all of the money and the funding is going out to private alternatives.
I can't resist. I'll pile on here. I think the first point that I would make, in addition to all of these very thoughtful points already made, would be that, in many cases, racially minoritized groups and low-income groups are being used by conservatives as a kind of, camel's nose, to use an antiquated metaphor here, right? To open the tent up for further privatization. So if we think back to the very first voucher programs in Milwaukee and Cleveland, they were very tightly bounded to serve low-income minoritized people. But of course, right, that was never the end game for the conservatives who supported those efforts. It was always about eventually unmaking the entire system. And so I'm not telling people to not act in their own self-interest. I'm a white man. I am a middle-class person with a terminal degree. So I speak from a position of privilege when I say this, but it is also the case that many of these communities are being used in these policy efforts. The second thing that I would say is that, they, in many cases, need to ask the question, am I getting a better education for my kid this way? Is it actually going to be better? Because there are a lot of reasons to think it actually might not be, right? So the correlation between demography and test results, SAT scores, college attendance, and college graduation is a pretty strong one there. We know that students at private schools, on average, have better test scores than students at public schools, and that if you account for demography, that actually they do worse. So if you account for demography there, for privilege, for racial privilege, economic privilege, linguistic privilege, if you account for that, what is the value added by these schools? And I'm not saying there's no value added. I'm saying that, we should ask questions. Additionally, think about the halo of exclusivity that surrounds some of these schools, right? Like for many of them, that's the biggest marketing point. It's certainly true in higher education, right? The schools that everybody wants to get into are the schools that are impossible to get into. And it's a beautiful closed loop there for those schools. And then, finally consider marketing, right? That public schools are just bad at marketing. Whereas schools that are competing in the free market do a lot to convince people that those schools are better. And then the final point that I would make is just one that, certainly would not satisfy an individual parent concerned first and foremost with their own kids. But, how are we going to systemically address inequality in education? You're certainly not going to do that with this kind of piecemeal approach by saying, well, let's give you an option and let's give you an option. As Carol said in her remarks, ultimately all that does is sink the ship.
Thank you, all three. I feel almost like I shouldn't ask another question because those responses were so great, but I'm going to try to get more in because we do have so many. So building off, Jack, I think your last point around the marketing aspect of the movement to dismantle public education, Brian asks a specific question about co-opting messaging. He's a retired teacher and union leader in the Bay Area, and he's seen privatizers and ed reformers attempt to co-opt progressive issues such as dismantling the school to prison pipeline. He's recently seen As folks have been discussing SROs in middle and high school campuses, organizers have actually stood outside and told parents the solution is to enroll in charter schools. So thoughts about this, I think co-opting in general and this specific example, and then advice if you have any.
I haven't heard any that particular example, but I was just thinking this morning about how it's only a matter of time before we see schools that operate in the market, and that would be charter schools and private schools, offering post-pandemic specific services. Right, that's the nature of the market, is that it rewards entities that are nimble, and so that those particular schools or that management organization, you got to think they're being kind of smart, right? That they see that this is in the air. This is something that people care about. Whereas if you're watching how this issue is playing out around the country, there's tremendous support for removing police from schools at the level of students and among a sizable chunk of the public. But once it gets to the school board level, that's where things start to get messy, right? And so the another advantage of having these schools that function in the market is that they don't have to deal with that, right? But that's also that's a terrible weakness. So as far as how do you respond to that? I think I'm going to let Jack take that.
Perfect. Let's see, how would I respond to that? I would say, for me, I think of this beautiful, weird little book that is now like 50 or 60 years old by Albert Hirschman, called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And, that many of these schools that operate in the market are trying to get people to think of themselves as consumers. When you're a consumer, the way that you exert agency is to exit when you are unhappy with something, right? And then you enter with a new firm. Firm is the word he uses. So, you stop drinking Coke and you start drinking Pepsi. That's how you exert your agency. In public life, you use voice. Oftentimes there isn't much of an exit opportunity, and that of course limits voice, but we can use our voice to actually change the way a system operates. And so if we think of ourselves as consumers, suddenly we're powerless to change schools. Oh no, there are discipline problems in sort of the disproportionality of them at this school. What could I possibly do other than leave? Well, it turns out there's an alternative, right? That we can band together and use our voice to demand change. And I frankly don't have a whole lot of faith in the promises made by organizations that are not accountable to the public, that are not particularly transparent in their practices, that when they say, no, we're going to do this thing that you like, you won't really have a voice over it, and we're not really accountable to you, but we'll do it because, we think that'll get you in the door. I don't have a whole lot of faith in that. Whereas I do have a lot of faith in people coming together to demand change. And the real challenge then is, how do we get people organized so that their voices can be heard, particularly when it comes to people who have for so long been marginalized, so that schools and districts are really responsive to them as well as to historically privileged groups.
And I think in many ways, what Jack talked about is the strength of public schools, and that's that they're founded on democracies where you can have that opportunity for change. I mean, if your child was suspended for 10 days from Success Academy Charter School, you're not going to be knocking on even Moskowitz's door, and she's not going to answer it if you do knock. I mean, there's limited ability to be able to speak up and affect change. Our three daughters went to public school, and it was not a particularly terrific public school system. And we thought about it. What should we do? Should we think about private school? There were not charter schools. There was not choice. And so what we did was we got involved. I ran for the school board. I affected change that way, organized other parents. It's not an impossibility to do. It's difficult to do, but it's not impossible. And I often wonder, if there had been some easy choices around, would I have not done that? And if I had not pursued that, would that system not have gotten better? And I do believe that during my 10 years on the school board, I was a positive force. So having that democracy in many ways in its purest form, right? It's very community rooted, where parents will go door to door and ask people to vote for them, or other community members. I don't think that's something that we want to lose, because if it becomes a market-based system, who are we going to go to when the market's a problem? How many times are we willing to take our 7-year-old, our 8-year-old, our 9-year-old and switch schools, trying to find a school that's right for them?
We are at time. I'll pause to see if Jennifer has any other last thoughts, closing thoughts.
Just thank you for convening this. I learned a lot.
Thank you all three for your work, first and foremost, and then for this very thought-provoking and inspiring discussion. I hope everyone has happy holidays, and check out the webinar on our website when Nicole sends out the link. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks.